Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out. My name is David Breslin, and I'm the John R. Eckel Jr. Foundation Chief Curator of the Menil Drawing Institute. And I'm thrilled that David Leslie is here, the Executive Director of the Rothko Chapel, to somewhat discuss the exhibition that's currently in the galleries, The Precarious, but I think more interestingly for all of us maybe, about themes that circulate around the exhibition that joins our two institutions. We don't want to use family metaphors, we were just talking about that, but maybe family, or we're brought together by this great bamboo fence between us. Let me just quickly introduce David. David became the Program and Membership Director of the Ohio Council of Churches in 1991. And in 1993, he took a position as Associate Director of Interfaith Ministries for Greater Houston, and later was promoted to Executive Director. He joined the chapel after serving for 18 years as Executive Director of Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon, a statewide interreligious association working together for unity and justice through advocacy, community ministry, and dialogue. Throughout his career, David has been devoted to interfaith relations, human rights, immigration reform, environmental justice, indigenous rights, and supporting important social causes. So we're thrilled that you're back in Houston, and thrilled that you're here tonight.
Well, it's good to be back. Thank you very much for having me.
My pleasure. So for those of you who might not have had a chance to see the exhibition that we're going to be talking about, the idea behind the show was to bring out some of the great works of collage, or works indebted to the collage tradition, that are in the Menil Collection. And so collage, as many of you know, are usually things made from found or thrown off resources, newspapers or a magazine or loose paper. And in the 1910s, Guillaume Apollinaire had this great line about how collage is steeped in humanity. So the idea behind the exhibition was to get these things that are steeped in humanity and also in some ways show that there is kind of a social metaphor to what's happening with collage. And that's why I took the title of the exhibition from some of the writing by Judith Butler, who wrote about precariousness around 2004. And she has this really wonderful line that says, "Precariousness implies living socially. That is, the fact that one's life is always, in some sense, in the hands of others." So this is something that I think David knows a lot about, and why I'm really glad that he agreed to speak about this exhibition. So I just want to quickly remind those of you who may or may not have seen the show what the show looks like. And then also remind us of 1971, the founding of the Rothko Chapel. And then 1997 with Dominique de Menil's last year. And I thought, without taking too many liberties with these artworks, the way that David and I could talk about this was to introduce some of the themes that some of these pieces bring to the surface. And with Kurt Schwitter's, this collage from 1921 made after World War I, I thought about the idea of radical hospitality. I've heard you speak about this before, and this might seem like a stretch, but I think Schwitter's is really engaging the world, welcoming the world into these pieces. So why have you used this term radical hospitality to talk about what the Rothko Chapel does, or what your work in communities is about?
Sure. It goes back to my early days. My father was a Presbyterian minister, and my mother was an educator. So if there was one consistent thing in our home, the door was open outward. It's a kind of the truism. If you have kids, you always have more than your own. They somehow exponentialize. I don't know. We had three boys, and there were always like 9 at home, and I couldn't tell who was who. But I think it was that idea of opening up to the stranger, or even to a friend or somebody in need. And I think that the act of hospitality is one that's rather universal.
Yeah.
Having traveled quite a bit, and maybe you and others in the audience tonight, that sense of being lost on a plane or on a train or in a town, and somebody who doesn't even know you just opens the door. There's something that is so humanizing about that act. I think at the Rothko Chapel, the thing that we're so privileged and blessed with is this idea of people coming from so many walks of life, so many backgrounds, not really ever knowing their story, but what we can do is open the doors outward and say, come in for a sense of respite. So I think that that's it's so important. It's so of the essence of what it means to be a human being.
Yeah, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to begin this exhibition with this artist. It's mostly an exhibition of American artists working after World War II, but Schwitters was very interested in the idea of bringing the discarded, the forgotten, in some ways the refuse of the society into what he was trying to do with these artworks. And I'm wondering for you, this relationship of the outsider when you do your work, is it something that is always in the consciousness of what you do, or is it just part of there is no outsider because everyone's welcome?
It's sort of a paradox, isn't it? To some extent, we're all outsiders, and to some extent, we're all insiders. It really depends on context. I think that one thing I've learned through my work, and I think especially working with, and I don't want to be pejorative, but saying marginalized communities, people who are on margins, and those can be social, economic, sexual. It gets defined in so many different ways. I think it's at that point of just being able to look someone in the eye, call them by name, and have that sense of connection in a world where so often we drop our eyes, we don't use a name, we put things into descriptions that are very ahuman or inhuman. And I think that idea of being discarded, so many people feel discarded. We'll talk further about the exhibit, that sense of being, moved out of your home, forced away. What does that mean to be then included, to be in, and then to also appropriate or reappropriate things that have been discarded in a new life kind of way, right? And I think that's part of what Schwitter's work was about, was reappropriating items that seem to have been no use anymore, right? Exactly.
Preparing for this conversation, I came across this really great piece of writing by Dominique de Menil, where she was kind of talking about the vocation of hospitality that the Rothko Chapel had, and she was comparing normal religious institutions to clubs, and then said, and I'm going to quote a little bit, "Maybe this is why so many of the young are staying away. They have no use for clubs. They have a thirst for brotherhood, a brotherhood that includes everybody, every race, every creed. They are attuned to what is happening in the world. Their sensitivity has not been blunted. They are aware of the famines and the wars and the torture. They know that we are threatened by economic collapses, police states, atomic warfare. They try to do something about it, but they don't know how and what." I was struck about how that could have been written this morning. And I wonder how these ideas of brotherhood, and I guess brotherhood maybe not be the best word, but issues of trying to find some radical equality to who you bring in, how that kind of motivates the work that you have done and what you're doing at the chapel.
Sure, I think, I mean, one of the real gifts of finding a vocational path that I didn't really look for, but ended up finding and working in interreligious context in other sectors. So being oftentimes in a position where you are bringing a religious insights in a table, though, that involves all kinds of other insights and other disciplines, is that there's something, a gift, it's somewhat unique in the sense that exactly what you read today also could have been 400 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago. I think this is the great insight of the best of religious traditions across time, which is that this interplay between the personal, impersonal, between individualism and communalism, between what it means to have value and to be valueless, right? These are things that are somewhat innate in the human condition and have been with us for a number of years. I think what's interesting when we think about many of the works that are in this exhibition, of how they grow out of a moment in history. They're this interplay, they're almost like a conversation, right? This interplay between what is, what could be, what am I struggling with as an individual, but also how does that translate to the larger community issue. And I think the gift again of a place like the Rothko Chapel is that it again says it welcomes those at the best. I mean, I'm not sure we always get it right, but at the best, it's a place where we can gather those positions, those conversations, with this nice caveat to say we always fall temptation to today is the first time I ever got this insight. You know, it's the first time that we've ever had to struggle with this. What we find though, we're not without company, right? This is a gift because this is oftentimes problems and solutions are written over time.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to. This is another Schwitter's that's in the exhibition, but I wanted to move to a work that was made in the 70s by Robert Rauschenberg, this great cardboard piece, excuse me, that he made right after he moved to Captiva Island in Florida. And he didn't have resource to some of the junk that he would find on the streets in New York that could be incorporated into his work. But he had this really great line about this work being about waste and softness, the idea that the cardboard had these qualities that were about things that were abandoned but could have this resonance with the human body. We're about waste and softness too in a lot of ways. But it also has a real resonance to not only our relationship to other people, but to the non-human actors, to our environment, to the way that it conditions us. And I wonder how that kind of inflects some of your thinking about what you do, because yes, we're engaged with people, but we know there's a lot more else that influences us.
You know, it's interesting spending the last 18 years in Oregon, which has a little different politic than Houston, Texas, my home state, by the way. I want to make sure you understand I'm not picking on my own people. But, you know, there is a little difference in some of the issues around what you do with discarded materials. Now, the good thing is about here, I think I made my 5th trip to the recycling center out on West Park with another load of boxes. So I really was zoning into this cardboard box metaphor. But I think that, you know, this is part of the world in which we live in the sense of what is our, you know, you might want to say stewardship. Another word might be fiduciary responsibility to not only this generation, but the next generation. You know, you may have heard there was a popular term that was popularized maybe 2 or 3 decades ago called environmental racism, where you suddenly find out that a lot of the depository for waste dumps could be very, very environmental toxic places are located where some of the poorest people of color actually live. There is a correlation. And it's sort of this cardboard box on a wall suddenly opens up some thinking into, you know, very, very multifaceted kind of ways. The other thing that it really struck me was with this particular piece, as we've seen in so many cities around the U.S., with the rise of homelessness, houselessness, people that are really struggling to find affordable housing, which you'll also find in other parts of the world, where a box like that on the wall can be repurposed to a home. It's kind of a shocking, kind of jarring thing, but that box on the wall suddenly has very multifaceted use, right? And that may be part of what's being communicated through this. I think, you know, coming again from the Northwest and working with a number of the tribal governments and tribal entities in that part of the world, being sensitive to also how wasteful we are as human beings, you know?
Yeah, and I think in some ways this comes to play in this, and obviously these blow the works up to a scale that they were never meant to be seen. This is a very kind of homely, domestic thing. It's a paper bag that you would get takeout with, that Rauschenberg has cut apart, put onto this piece of paper, drawn a pencil line around, and then covered with this kind of gouache white, ghostly white. And in some ways, it never monumentalizes what's being done. Even with that huge cardboard piece that's on the back wall in the galleries, there's never a desire to make big into monumental. It's to make it, in some ways, consequential, that these things are, the material is important. It's not the scale itself that needs to carry that message. And I wonder, about this issue of scale when it comes to these ideas of importance. You think about how many people are outside of the Rothko chapel on a weekend, and maybe it'll be 15 people inside, and they're getting as much from almost the spirit of the place.
Right.
And it's not because necessarily of the scale of what's happening, but the importance of the message that comes from it. And I wonder about how you think about, particularly on a night of a primary, how big of a mouth do you need to have to get your message across, and what the role of the chapel is in thinking about those issues?
Well, it's for those of you who all have been in the chapel, and if you haven't, when you go in, there's something that is fairly monumental about the Mark Rothko murals that are in the chapel. I mean, they are built to scale. I mean, they're built to size, very intentionally, right? Yeah. I mean, they have that's an intentionality. It communicates something, but also in the gallery here, when you see these very fine pieces of work where you really have to enter into it in another kind of way, right? It's a little different way of entering into dialogue, conversation with the piece, that something very small can speak very loud also. Yeah. And I think that, years ago, it kind of dawned on me that, working as I did for so many years with religious communities all over the country, and then in the Northwest, which has a very rural part of life, that oftentimes that small congregation was kind of thrown off the side. It was kind of dismissed because it wasn't the mega congregation. It wasn't the big, and in this city, I think we've got our examples of mega congregations. But oftentimes it was that very small congregation that was doing very profound work in that community. It might have been the only place where there was a theater space, the only place that was doing after-school tutoring or, meals for, people living on the margins of society. So I think we have to be, I think that's the interesting thing about this particular exhibit, that it really forces you to kind of rethink your sense about scale and size, et cetera. I mentioned to you this as a little background info for the audience, but I had the privilege of walking through with David at the exhibit, and I said, one of the articles that really caught my attention, the Chronicle or the Post when I used to live here, was a little article about these women that were doing tatting, which is very fine needlepoint. And what really struck me was the fact that here were these women, pretty anonymous, holding on to try to keep this tradition, this art form, alive, right? So there's something powerful and something very small that may speak louder than what sometimes is very big.
Yeah. Well, when the exhibition opened, a very nice patron came up to me and said, "Wow, you were very brave to open the show up with nothing on that front wall."
Oh.
And there were a lot of people in there, so I could tell that one couldn't see everything. But what you do see is there's just this really small pencil line that goes up the wall, on the top, on the ceiling, 50 centimeters exactly, and then on the bottom, a small collage piece. But the artist, Richard Tuttle, came here to install that work, and I think he was, and I said, you can put it wherever you want. I would kind of like it there, but you're the boss. And I think he liked it there because it provided an opening for others. If you had put another work there, it might have foreclosed what conversations and the place of the viewer there, but this hopefully opened it up. And I think this is in some ways what you're saying, providing, you don't need to have the scale to provide a clearing for other people to have a presence or a voice.
No, and I think, you take a moment like, take a moment like 9/11. On the large scale, we get this big image. But I think what moved hearts and minds the most, at least it brought me to tears, are hearing those cell phone calls, right? Those very intimate, very personalized actions or acts as human beings that really take that large and put it into a much more profoundly meaningful piece. At the Rothko Chapel, we have, like a lot of institutions, a visitor's book you can sign. And it's really interesting that amongst this wonderful art, this wonderful sacred spiritual place, this place with the plaza with the broken obelisk, which by the way is gone, but it will be back by the end of the year, thanks to our friends at the Menil and the conservator team, that you read those stories, or you have a privilege of sitting with somebody for a minute, and it really brings it to the right scale, right? It's sort of that little piece that puts it all in its proper context, if that makes some sense to you.
It does. And I think that's a perfect way to segue to this fantastic group of works that's part of the Menil's collection. These are, this is one, and in the exhibition there are 6 elements from Ellsworth Kelly's tablet. And that consists of 188 of these. They're not necessarily collages themselves, but they're accumulations of these notes, studies, drawings that he's put together that were working things from the 1950s through the 1970s. And when Yves Lambois was here a couple months ago to give a great talk about Kelly, who sadly just passed away right after Christmas, he described Kelly as having the visual equivalent of perfect pitch. And I thought this was a really beautiful way of thinking about the fact that you're kind of scavenging the environment and you see something that really has some resonance, or you hear something that has some resonance, and only because you can hear it can you spit it back out. And that, again, in preparation for this, I came across another beautiful thing from Dominique de Menil. And I'm going to read it again. Sorry for conjuring that. This attitude of receptivity, and she's talking about Rothko here, indispensable in art, is also the attitude necessary for ecumenism, to listen. For centuries, religious leaders, missionaries have done all the talking. There's nothing wrong in the talking except that it never stopped. Those who were talked to, never had a chance to respond. It was never assumed that they might have something to contribute, some tradition, some personal experience. There's a growing awareness that God does not only speak through his appointed ministers, that he may be at work everywhere in the world, everywhere people of goodwill get together, everywhere creative people are trying to open a new door. There's always more than meets the eye in an authentic work of art. So we hear the term ecumenical, and many of us and me sometimes need to look it up and think about, well, what's the relationship between non-denominational and ecumenical? What's the idea between one who espouses certain views and one who is listening to others? And I know that's so key to, what's happening next door, and I wonder if you could talk about that a little.
I think that, at least for me, the premise, sort of the root of ecumenism, is a sense of the whole household. It's a very inclusive term. And I think it was, we know that even before Vatican II, as sort of what would be the modern day ecumenical movement starts to form with Rauschenbusch and sort of the social gospel movement, that what was very challenging about it wasn't about a lot of talking. It was about, hey, I've been gifted to receive this from somebody, now we got to give it voice. And it really challenges and continues to challenge both in a religious and a non-religious way, the way we organize our lives, the hierarchies we have, the caste systems we build, to a kind of a radical democratization, right? So if I begin with the premise that we're all part of the same kind of DNA, right? We have this same fabric, or to put in religious terms, if everyone is a person of a child of the Creator, then it should do something to start breaking apart, or at least exert into those things that we order and we prescribe have to be this way. I think that's where, again, some of the great religious leaders that have gifted, the threshold of the chapel, like the Dalai Lama, or somebody like Archbishop Tutu, lives that every way, because one of their gifts, they're really great speakers, but they're also incredible listeners. I think you all probably know that just wonderful experience it is to be in the presence of somebody who might be speaking to 10,000 people, but you think you've got a conversation going, because they have that innate ability to listen. When I saw this piece, I was just blown away. And I know there's no subtle message in here around politics of the day. I know there's that Vermont thing caught my attention. But it's also that it's a playfulness of an idea, of a concept, that then gets played with over and over again, right? Various different iterations that oftentimes are kept in a notebook for decades.
Right, exactly.
And then one day, boom, it just hit. And I think that gave me a sense of my own personal sense of well-being, that, hey, we don't have to have it all right now. But part of it is that interplay, that both listening, speaking, and then giving it form in different ways.
I mean, what I love about this piece, and I didn't explain it as well as I could have, these were things that were just sitting under his bed in boxes until the early mid-2000s, when Bois said, you should really do something with this, Ellsworth. And then he began to arrange them in these tablet-size formats, where things from the 50s could be next to something in the 70s, and perhaps something from the 50s was only made into a quote-unquote final work in the 90s. So this idea that ideas can be recycled, that something that's put into a drawer is actually the thing that will be the gem that you kind of go to later. It's really important to these. But one of the pieces that really strikes me in this is obviously a very of a particular time. You see the text on the upper left referring to the VC. You see someone in military garb, but you see that the arm is abstracted into Kelly-like almost state of California. And I think what's remarkable to me about this is that abstraction in some ways isn't necessarily something divorced from the world. It's not a fleeting thing taken away or abstracted from it. If you're going to believe in abstraction, you need to believe that abstraction is in the world as well for good and for bad. We don't know what's happening here. I think it's very interesting that this is in a very, we don't know the end of this young man or the other young man in the picture. But this open-endedness, this idea about hierarchies is also very much being disrupted as well. And I just love this "we want" that was pulled out. And the last group of images I thought we could talk about before we take some questions from the audience are these two pieces by Jan Vo. And some of you were here, I know, for Jan's conversation a couple weeks ago. This is a piece called Yadab et Ni Maro Ct, which I stupidly thought was a Vietnamese transliteration of something, except that when you read it backwards, it says, "It is warm in the body." And this is a phrase that comes from The Exorcist, and it's the young girl who has the devil within her, speaking out and saying these things in reverse. But these are, in some ways, very violent pieces. I asked Jan a little bit about their violence, and it seemed something that he didn't want to go into. Because I think that the violence to the work of art is there, but there's the implication of the violence that's done to the body almost too regularly. And as someone who was a refugee himself, who is very sensitive to the idea of bodies being manipulated to get from point A to point B, there's a lot going on in this piece. Yeah. And I wonder what your reaction to this work was, and also, how you see it in light of the things happening today.
Well, my first reaction, knowing Jan Vo was a refugee and knowing a bit about his story, being on a boat and seeing that box from a distance, not knowing there was anything in it, it just reminded me of that being on a boat with something very utilitarian, but might have all your life belongings in it. That could be something so many, we hear so many stories about refugees, even today, where boats sink, right? People drown. That could be something that could be the preserver that maintains life. And then walking up and seeing this cut away from something ancient, I think, right? Yeah. A piece of work from antiquity in the box also brings, it's my own orientation, right? Female genitalia mutilation. I've been on the board for years in the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, and hearing the discussion even this past weekend about, is waterboarding torture or not? And I'm thinking about what we do to each other, what we do to ourselves in kind of that mutilation kind of way. And it really just hit really there. I also, with a lot of my work with the refugee communities, variety of backgrounds, I'm just always so aware of what one of my colleagues from Sarajevo said, that, literally was drinking tea in the backyard on a Sunday and bombs falling in that yard the next day. And that sense about how, with this title, The Precarious, right? How precarious life really is, right? It can be so joyful one second, and then the next it can be so horrific. And somehow that piece really captures that both and for me.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of extraordinary to think that the starting point for the work is the found wood box, the carnation milk thing. And the thing that's supposed to be the exalted thing is forced to conform to kind of the demoted, almost regular thing. So again, this kind of shifting of hierarchies. For me, what's been very interesting, and I've here as the curator of drawings, to think about the history of drawing as a so-called secondary medium. But you have painting and sculpture, and then you have drawing. And I think that one of the purposes of what we're trying to do here and also across the street with the building is to rethink those categories. But I also think there's something very strong about embracing something like a historical secondary status to play up the fact that, well, people are now using drawing, artists of color, a lot of artists in the gay community, because it has this resonance. It hasn't always been preferred. So I wonder if I mean, this kind of idea of shifting kind of the utility or the metaphor of what a drawing could be has any kind of relatability to what you're doing.
Well, that's a good question. Sometimes I feel like I'm just on that treadmill going through it. I think that part of what I found myself thinking about in preparation for this particular conversation tonight is at the Rothko Chapel, and we'll just use that as the most parochial and local place for me right now, is how do we create images and narratives using kind of maybe secondary, maybe even further down the chain, mediums such as tears, laughter, hopes, fears, things that are not tangible per se, but as you put them together into a narrative, and it can be done orally, there's a lot of ways it can be done because we know it's been done through song, through poetry, through word, through painting, that suddenly we're getting at this idea of the precarious, this idea of what does it mean to be human and what does it mean to be in this struggle? To be at that point between great hope, that sense of existential being of autonomy, existence forever. On the other hand, the fragility of what it means to be a human being. And so I got to thinking about the collages that we, how do we paint that? How do we do that, in our life? I think that the chapel's kind of interesting because if you've been in there before, most people don't, if this part of Mark Rothko's work, don't usually use vibrant color in the same sentence, right? But as you sit there and you sit with the work, it's very, in one way, it's iconography. It is a portal. It's a way of telling a story without giving you a lot. That way, it may be an iconography, but it invites exactly what this is doing through that medium. I think that's all I can really say on that because it's a profound interplay of so many different elements. And then it is up to the artist, whoever that might be, is to give them some form for discussion and for this kind of engagement. Well,
and I think this is the other piece by Jan in the exhibition, Fiat Veritas et Pereat Mundus, Let There Be Truth, Though the World Be Lost, which is from Hannah Arendt, Truth and Traps. And if you open up the box as it's installed, that text has been written inside by his father, who has this amazing penmanship. And on the outside is gold leaf replicating the Budweiser that was on the box to begin with. So, I mean, this idea of the circulation of the object, but also the incorporation of other people's labor, his father's, the artists in Thailand who applied the gold leaf, this idea that it took everyone, including Jan, but a number of other people to make this, it seems implicit to the piece. And it seems one of the reasons why I wanted to get us together was we're neighbors. We have our
Right.
parallel tracks of what we do. But it's because we do our things in this synchrony that I think we make each other better. And I wonder if, as kind of a concluding before we open it up to questions, what you think the relationship between the two places can be, and how can we best be good neighbors to you?
Well, I think we do share that common genesis and a lot of common DNA and a lot of common stories. I think, being complementary neighbors is very, very important. I mean, the thing about coming back to this city that has changed so much over the last 18 years, and to have this gift of being able to come to this just physical place is something that we have mutual stewardship responsibilities for. I mean, that's number one. Being in a major urban center like this, to have this is really such a gift. And I think more and more queries are going to come. How do you do that? How do you maintain it? How do you hold it? I think the second thing is that within a healthy relationship, it's again complementary. Each party or parties have gifts and talents to offer. I think when people are most successful, movements are most successful, is when you're able to put together those gifts and talents around a common agenda, but at the same time, and this is really out of this ecumenical interfaith work, my job is not, no one's role is to convert another to each other's place, but it's to learn, you may differentiate, but at the same time, you realize that in that diversity is some strength, and then being able to decide at sometimes, what do you lead with?
Yeah.
What's the point? And I think that an institute like the Menil Collection has certain gifts and talents it can lead with. We at the chapel have some freedoms that we can lead with. But I think coming back to what do we really stand for in the sense of this radical democracy that underpins both institutions, radical hospitality, this opening doors outward to the community, to invite people to come and explore life from so many different facets, and saying that you don't have to be on one track, and one track doesn't exclude the other track, right? That's also something I think we share in common. And the other thing, and I think using Mrs. D. Menil's quotes is so well framed for this talk tonight, is that going back and realize that she would say, I'm on the shoulders of giants that came before and we are today. So to some extent, we're carrying on this legacy that not everybody has the same vested interest in. So those are just a few thoughts of, again, how we share space together. We have some things that distinguish the two institutions, but at the same time, what makes the relationship great. And then ultimately, it's what have you done in the world? Yeah. What are you actually giving? And I think that's where there's more power working together and sharing together than there would be doing things apart.
Well, look forward to doing it with you.
We'll see what that works in the days ahead.
And we'd be happy to take any questions that you might have. If nothing, have a great night. Don't sweat the New Hampshire primary too much. And thanks, everyone, for coming out.
Thank you.